Welcome back to the Astro Insights podcast. Today's guest is Rod Susskind, who joins us for a conversation about practicing divination at the nexus between history, hemisphere, and heritage, an approach deeply rooted in his home country of South Africa, where African ancestral wisdom intersects with European astrology and Western medicine. In this episode, we explore the enduring connection between astrology and herbalism, compare African and European cosmologies and approaches to healing, and consider how divination can bridge worlds, creating space for cultural integration and confluence, where traditions can meet not in tension, but in dialogue. We also examine how colonial legacies can sometimes shape spiritual authority, asking who is granted access to healing and whose knowledge is deemed credible. Rod also reflects on his unique personal divination journey as both an astrologer and an African traditional healer, offering us some insights into how seemingly disparate traditions can coexist, inform and transform one another to create a rich, pluralistic tapestry that can offer clients and practitioners a more nuanced, layered and integrative experience. Okay, so welcome back to the Astro Insights podcast. With me today is Rod Susskind, who is an astrologer, a household name in South Africa, an initiated Sangoma, which is a South African shaman, a lecturer, a well-known broadcaster, and many other things sort of to boot. Rod lives in Cape Town, South Africa, and it's a place I once lived myself and that I have a really emotional connection to. So I guess this particular podcast is a little bit of professional and personal kind of all mingled into one. So welcome, Rod.
Hey, Lisa, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. So yes, I mean, obviously I've been aware of you for quite some time. Kind of growing up in South Africa, you were very sort of prevalent in the media and that kind of thing. But I don't really know much about how you got into astrology and what your journey is. So maybe you'd like to, share some of that with our listeners.
I think like a lot of people, astrology started when I was very young.
Uh-huh.
I remember going on a holiday with Michael and Hart when I was about 10 or 11. And there was we bumped into a friend of his who was drawing charts by hand in those days. That would have been the 70s.
Gosh.
And I started asking a million questions. And he said, listen, when you get back home, go and buy this book. And the book he recommended was Derek and Julia Parker's Complete Astrology, which has been in print ever since.
Yes, I know it well. And
Yes,
it's also very formative in my astrology sort of journey too.
Because it let you actually draw charts. It's the only book that kind of taught you and was doable, especially for a kid, to actually draw a chart. So I started doing it right back then.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, doing astrology through my teenage years, it was kind of a very natural thing. I never had ambitions I'm going to become an astrologer or anything like that. I do remember being very startled when I was about maybe 15 and my oldest brother had this new girlfriend and he wanted to give her a kind of a future report as a birthday present.
Right.
So he made me do it, and I did transits and progressions at that time. That would have been secondary progressions back then. And then time passed, and I kind of moved on. I didn't even think about it. And then years later, we were cleaning out his car, and I would have been 18 or 19, and I found the report in his car, and I said, "Didn't you ever give this to her?" I was horrified. He said, "No, I didn't give it to her because of what you said in it." And what I'd said in it is that they would break up and she'd go with another man who she'd marry. And that's exactly what happened.
Oh, goodness.
And I was shocked at how true it was. And that really taught me, they hadn't really done predictive things. I was a kid until then.
Interesting.
So that was quite a powerful thing.
Yes, to sort of see astrology in action. I mean,
Exactly. And see that it really worked.
Yes, and it's kind of incontrovertible. You can't explain it. It's not logical, but you know it works. It's your kind of that sort of judder that Maggie Hyde would talk about. That physical sensation in your body where you realize like there's something in this.
Exactly. But I was very much a mixture of a kind of a scientific and a mystical kid.
Mm-hmm.
And my father, who was a pharmacist, always thought I'd follow in his footsteps because I was so good at science and I loved chemistry. I'm very rational. All
Mm-hmm.
of those things were there from the beginning.
Yes.
But at the same time, I was reading tarot cards since I was 9. I was claiming to see angels in my room. I was doing all of that, and I didn't know where I came from.
Yes, so a really interesting marriage, which I think is sort of become a theme in your work because you sort of you're an astrologer, but you also practice as a sangoma, which presumably also involves things like herbalism and which is
Yeah,
a kind of chemistry. And yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because um, I mean herbalism is I mean it's huge in South Africa, but it's also something that has had a long history with astrology as well, with sort of the moon phases and when to pick various herbs and all the like if you think about Nicholas Culpeper and
yeah.
all of his work with this sort of the astrological associations, planetary associations with different herbs and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to ask you about that.
So, yes, I mean, it's a herbalism based form of healing.
Uh-huh.
And I had become fascinated also at about 15. I discovered that herbs could be medicine, and I just couldn't believe that no one just did this.
Mm.
I started growing all these herbs in my mother's garden. You can imagine what she thought I was growing, but it really was medicinal herbs. For what? I don't know. I didn't know what I was going to do with them,
Hmm.
but because I was a child, I would give medicine to anyone. But
Yes.
when I was 19 at second year university,
Hmm.
we had the professor, a psychology professor, who kind of, as he put it, wanted us to see how psychology was done in Africa. And
Hmm.
he arranged for us to visit Sangomas. Now, this was in the dark days of apartheid. So,
Wow.
very little, any kind of contact between black and white people, except in that the inequality of the servant relationship.
Yes.
So it's quite amazing because they read my bones. I didn't say a word except my name. They read my bones. From
Hmm.
there, they told me I'm growing herbs in my garden and I'm a sangoma and I've got to come back and get initiated.
Oh my
And
goodness.
and I thought they were just being polite. They picked up that I read the tarot cards. I thought, oh, they were just interpreting me reading the tarot cards. And I got out of there as fast as I can, and I bumped straight into that professor. And he said, "How was that?" So I told him what they said, and he said, "You're going back next week." So
Gosh.
he pushed me into it. Well, and it was a hell of an experience. I mean, luckily I was 19, so kind of fearless at that age.
Yes.
And normally the Sangoma process is a very, very, very difficult training because of the resistance of the person and the arduous things you have to go through.
Uh-huh.
But what happens in the tradition is that when it comes up in a child, children don't resist.
Oh, interesting.
Now, normally, if it comes up in someone's family, in a child, the adults will resist. So they'll do ceremonies to try and persuade them, the ancestors, to leave alone and all of that. But no one stopped me. I was the youngest child and everyone trusted me. I just did what I wanted. I grew the medicines. I learned how to divine with tarot cards. I did all these things that normally children are stopped.
Mm.
So luckily, the path of becoming a Sangoma was much easier for me. As they said that they had to straighten me out, not wake me up.
Yeah, interesting because yeah, with some sangomas and shamans, there's a sense of you have to have the sort of the illness first. You have
Yeah,
to sort of reach a
exactly.
crisis point before you sort of finally
Exactly.
say, okay, I have to do this, otherwise I'm not going to get better, sort of thing.
Yeah, we call it the illness of recording. So that
Um,
in children, it can sometimes not happen. And with me, obviously the illness must have been so young and I responded to it.
yes.
So that's how they saw it. So yeah, so the next thing I became a Sangoma, but I already knew astrology
Uh-huh.
and herbalism. And so right from the beginning, I was always interested in kind of finding a crossover, or whatever, between all the planetary rulerships of the European herbs
Yes.
and those of the African herbs.
Yes. Interesting.
So, a lot of many, I should say, of the herbs that we grow in Africa are European herbs, thanks to mostly Cecil John Rhodes.
Uh-huh.
Um, so there is a lot of crossover anyway, and it was just a case of learning the different names that they've been given. But then also, the basic principles are there. So in astrology, we learn things from traditional herbalism, like a herb might be hot in the 2nd degree and dry in the 3rd degree. And there are all these degrees. That's why we say 3rd degree burns to this very day.
Oh, right. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there are all these up to 4 degrees of hot, cold, dry, and wet in every medicine and in every illness.
So that's sort of the Pythagorean qualities.
Exactly.
Okay, right.
So I thought that's easy to match. So for example, we've got certain herbs. A very well-known herb that we use is called Interlezi.
Uh-huh.
And Interlezi is a bulb that is crushed that is used to either chase out bad vibes or to punish naughty children. And so you crush the bulb, mix it with cold water and wash with it, and your skin starts burning like nobody's business.
Oh, hell.
And the interesting thing is, in the case of chasing out bad vibes, if there are no bad vibes,
Yes.
then your skin won't burn.
Oh.
So definitely, so we know it's very real, this stuff, because if bad stuff's been going on, if you've been doing bad, if you're under attack by bad people, whatever, you'll feel it a lot. And it goes away after about half an hour, and doesn't do any physical damage. So I know I can classify that as, hot in the 2nd degree, for example. It's very hot, but doesn't actually blister the skin. 3rd degree would blister the skin, 4th degree always kills you. Sorry about that, oops.
So with the kind of the hot and that sort of thing, is that sort of alluding to like Mars and?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So I would give that as a Mars medicine. Saturn would be a dry medicine, for example.
Okay.
Moon and Venus is often given as moist. So I did a certain amount of that on and off over the years, especially, much later on in my life. I then met and married another Sangoma who was very, very steeped in the rural tradition. He was trained in the rural environment. I was trained in Soweto in Johannesburg.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah, I should have asked you because there are, of course, different tribes in South Africa. So
exactly.
Right. So you were sort of trained in the Sesotho tradition, is that right?
I was actually trained under the auspices of Swazi people.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And extra interesting is these days, it wasn't so much a big deal then. These days, there are actually 2 Swazi traditions. It's been nearly 200 years, which is as long as the Swazis have been around. But I was trained in the more traditional one. These days, there's a kind of another one that's taken over with them.
Oh,
but that's a different technical issue. Then I met this guy who was Pondo, which is northeastern Eastern Cape, what used to be called the Transkei.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, quite an it's not like Xhosa. We're talking more here about quite a small tribe. I mean, not that well known.
Exactly. They are considered somewhat incorrectly part of the Xhosa Greater Nation. Their language is a dialect of Xhosa.
Okay.
But it's not actually exactly the same. They're a small old tribe, right just below the Zulu nation.
Interesting.
So they share words with Zulu. They've got many more cliques than the other Xhosas because they had more direct contact with the Khoisan people a long time ago.
Oh, interesting. Yes, and they are kind of arch herbalists and things.
And exactly, that's where they are arch herbalists, and they're the origin of all the cliques in African languages.
Interesting.
So they're an interesting bunch. And so their medicine is very old. Their plants are very powerful. So I started working more and more with those medicines for which I had no European equivalent. I didn't know any English names of them. And, we'd run into the forest in the middle of the night and pull something out of the ground. So, okay, I don't know what that's what happens.
Yes, and some of them now, I mean, am I correct in thinking that some of the herbs that like the Khoisan used, something with a W that became quite widely known about 2005, 2006, something like that, which was discovered in South Africa, I think through the Khoisan, and is a wide spectrum antibacterial that's used particularly in secondary infections in HIV patients. And that seemed to be something that pharmaceutical companies were interested in testing. So, I mean, these herbs are extremely powerful.
They are. I mean, let alone that. There's one that they use, what Westerners would use for weight loss. So everyone's running around risking it with Ozempic
Yes.
and vicious things like that. And actually, we've got a medicine that just takes away your appetite but causes no damage.
Interesting. Yes. So I mean, there's a deep tradition in Africa of sort of alternative medicine and herbal use and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's considered very normal, whereas I think here it's still like frowned upon by like the medical profession and that sort of stuff.
Now, Europe had a very up and down relationship with herbal medicine. I mean, the tradition that we're talking about is the English tradition of herbs. In modern Germany, it became standardized medicine. And even
Interesting.
to this day, the standard for herbalism is defined by a German system. However, in more recent years, I don't want to like sound like I'm banging a drum about the pharmaceutical companies. I'm not that kind of person really, but the fact is that they are. So they've reduced and made illegal many herbs. They've taken it out of health shops all over Europe.
Yes.
And many of them, the pharmaceutical companies, are actually creating not new medicines. They are releasing the herbs, but they're registering them so that no one else can use them.
Which is
Which is
just a travesty.
Similar to how we got into this situation in the 16th century under King James, which is how we got into this very split medical system that we have today.
Oh, I don't. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
So, obviously, as we know, it was barbers were the surgeons and astrologers, wise women, general herbalists were the medicine people.
Okay.
And the surgery started getting taught at universities.
Right.
And eventually the College of Surgeons appealed to the king for a grant. And then they appealed to the king, who was James, that they must be the only ones allowed to practice medicine because they've been to university. So they created a law that the apothecaries were only allowed to dispense, not prescribe. And now all the names must be written in Latin so that the apothecaries who weren't educated couldn't know what they were. So you go into an apothecary, obviously the ancestor of the modern chemist.
Yes.
All the names written in Latin, that stayed into the 20th century. And supposedly the idiot apothecary who's been doing this his whole life, he could probably tell what the herbs were with his eyes closed, but never mind. He'd be given a piece of paper with the name written on in Latin. He would match that off a jar in the shelf and give the medicine. So the doctor would give you a piece of paper. You go to the apothecary, who gives you a medicine that he doesn't know what it is. Then you go home and take it on your own. And it broke down the system whereby you went to the herbalist who treated you because he was the doctor. You didn't take it home or go somewhere else or something like that. And so you got healed in a much more holistic fashion. And so he created that system that that completely broke down and created the modern system. You go to the doctor, he's not allowed to dispense. He sends you the piece of paper to the chemist, he's not allowed to prescribe. And then you've got to go home and self-manage on this medicine. The interesting thing is our dear ancestral astrologer, William Lilly, as you know, he worked around the corner in London from Nicholas Culpeper. And Culpeper was also an astrologer, but he was the great English herbalist.
Yes.
Of the 17th century. So what Culpeper did is he took the Materia Medica, the textbook of all those Latin herbs, he translated it into English and published it illegally.
Oh, interesting. So this is sort of the kind of the chaotic milieu of the printing presses and sort of when they got rid of censorship briefly.
Exactly. And it's because it's also in the chaos of the fall of King Charles I.
Yes.
And so England is under revolution. And Culpeper, he does, I mean, it sounds so modern. He prints the thing that nobody's supposed to know what it means, and he publishes it widely. And to this day, that is the source of his very famous book, Culpeper's Complete Herbal.
Yes, yes.
Which is the best-selling book in history after the Bible.
Yes, and it's a fabulous book. I've got a copy somewhere.
Culpeper was quite an innovator. So, for example, he invented the urine test.
Oh.
Yeah, so he invents the urine test. He's quite forward-thinking in how medicine should be, but he is practicing the classical, more kind of you know, traditional Pythagorean hot, cold, dry, wet, all of the
Yes.
herbal ways. So Culpeper was very much an innovator, both in his methodology, and he also properly classified all the herbs and their traditional categories.
Interesting. But still, I mean, astrology is still the backbone of all of that stuff because
Yeah.
of it being so integrated into the cosmology and reading different parts of the body and reading different herbs and that kind of stuff. So
And
I mean,
remains that when homeopathy developed later on,
uh-huh.
you know, pretty much astrology is still the only source of what they need to classify body types, medicine types, and they
Mhm.
continue to use the astrological system.
Yes, yes. And also for diagnosing, I mean, it sounds like he would often do these charts where he would try to plot the course of an illness using a sort of like a type of horary chart sort of thing
Yes, it's
with the
called a
moon.
decumberature chart. Decumberature chart means
That's it.
a chart
Yes.
for lying down.
Yes.
And but again, Culpeper was the master of that. So Culpeper's book on decumberature charts is mind blowing. I use them a lot. I use his
Ah,
method directly. So I
yes.
guess in
Mm.
one sense, he is Paracelsian in the modernness of his approach. I think Paracelsus is mostly credited with the kind of the move towards scientific medicine.
Well, I mean, he later became that, but he certainly wasn't that actually. Like, if you look at his work, he was very sort of interested in like hermeticism. He's still linking everything together, the
Yeah,
sort of like the macrocosm and the microcosm,
right.
and seeing everything as being holistic. I mean, I think maybe, it wasn't Paracelsus himself, but more how he was kind of later interpreted
Right,
it.
right, of course.
Um, and as you say, because at this time, and sort of certainly going into the next century, as Uranus is discovered, we're having this kind of scientific revolution where astrology is really declining in credibility, and science is kind of on the rise. And so you're starting to get that split where
Right.
any
Yeah.
respectable sort of intellectual or doctor or what wouldn't openly associate themselves
Mm,
with astrology.
mm. That's interesting because one wonders, and I'm just speculating,
Hmm.
if Culpeper, being the highly educated man that he was, is sensing the currents of change
Yes.
and adapting himself and looking forward, not as forward enough yet, because it's the middle of the 17th century, but everything is changing. Astrology is already changing, and he's sensing forward and he's developing these modern attitudes.
Oh, yes.
People,
Well, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think this is the influence of humanism. I mean,
yeah,
I think you can see it in Lilly, where he also does Christian astrology in English, so that people who don't speak Latin can
yeah,
also sort of learn astrology. You can see it in this explosion of the printing press, where knowledge is becoming more democratized. And in the English Civil War itself, where the people are
yeah.
now saying we want power. The parliamentarians are seizing power from the monarchy. So definitely there's this kind of humanism creeping in that is inspiring these people to democratize and to print and to write in English and that kind of thing. I mean, I think we forget about that now, that what a
Exactly.
revolutionary time it was.
Exactly.
Um,
We don't give them credit, you know.
Yes, yes. But I mean, it's interesting then to look at that and sort of say, so, Lily and Culpeper in the sort of minds of the elitists would be considered part of folk medicine, which is
Yeah.
certainly what I would imagine that African traditional healers and so on are still considered today. That there's
Mhm.
still this divide between, as you were saying,
Exactly. I
the
mean,
med.
it's interesting in South Africa,
Hmm.
obviously, because of our multicultural and because we are predominantly actually traditional law is still very important here. Um, it is taken seriously, but here we've always had these two worlds in one place. So you have this
Yes,
modern Western style country merged, overlaid with an ancient traditional culture.
yes,
And so there is a kind of a little bit of a strain between the two. But still, the government, by law and tradition, respects traditional medicine as a primary health care.
yes.
Yeah,
That's
so it's
really
like
good.
most people will go to a Sangoma before they go to a doctor still. So they still accept that. However, they've of course increasingly made laws trying to control it.
Mm.
and they are increasingly aware of some of the issues they have. Those kind of things still exist. But why there's such a deep cultural underlay? So loosely, and again, somewhat incorrectly, various tribes of South Africa, of the eastern half of South Africa, are
Yes.
referred to as the Nguni tribes.
Okay.
So that's largely the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Panda, and the many of the other sub-tribes in that area.
Mm-hmm.
It's the largest grouping in the country. And of course, the Xhosa themselves are the largest group in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Their cosmology is the only known cosmology in all of history that is based not on the idea of creating a world, but of healing a world. They
Mm.
don't believe that a divine being creates it from nowhere and then does whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that there is this broken world that needs healing. So their whole cosmology is based on the idea of healing, which is unique. But it underlies why the Sangoma is so important.
Mm-hmm.
That's and ultimately, in terms of this world, the only healing you can do to this world is healing people. So
Interesting.
that's
So,
why
so
it's
the
so
world
important.
itself is not considered
Yeah,
sort of inferior or damaged or broken. It's the
yeah,
human being who's not
it's
in
the
right
healing.
relationship.
Exactly. That's exactly that.
Hmm.
So and then it's fixed by creating right relationship with each other. It's not oriented towards nature. It's oriented towards other human being. So the whole focus of Sangoma healing is to primarily heal the interactions between people, both
Hmm.
living people and each other and the living and the dead. It's all about
Yes.
harmonizing those relationships, which is why the Sangoma is second only to the chief in status. That before a dispute goes to a chief, it can go to a Sangoma
Hmm.
so that he can create peace in the village or the community again. And people have to listen.
That's so interesting. I mean, oh gosh, if only we had a Sangoma in the Middle East right now. Yes. I mean, that's just that's fascinating. So it's kind of relationship based, and
Yeah.
um, sort of. I'm just sort of going back to what you were saying about your partner. Presumably, there's a lot of the information is transmitted orally. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Very much.
And that's going to sort of be slightly different with each sangoma or sort of each lineage, because
Yes.
I mean, with
Yes.
this emphasis on the ancestors, which is something, I mean, I find this so fascinating, as this is a real difference between modern Western culture and traditional African culture, where um, you know, traditional cultures generally value the wisdom of elders and they
Mm.
respect the ancestors. Whereas in the West, we are more sort of like focused on, I mean, sort of, it's youth worship really,
Yeah.
and sort of
Exactly.
this focus on this obsession with progress. Um,
Exactly. So you see, because the concept at its core is that the people who've come before you have learned all the stuff. They've been through the mill. Why do you want to
yes,
start at zero again?
yes,
Rather benefit from what you're told from the ancestors so that you can be a master without having to go through all of that.
yes, and not reinvent the wheel, as you say.
Yeah. So as much as there is variation from tribe to tribe or lineage to lineage, the one thing that is universal in all the African tribes is the veneration of the ancestors. It's not the worship of the ancestors, as it's
Mhm.
often incorrectly stated, because most African people believe in God. Most of that is influenced by colonialism,
Yes.
but there also are earlier concepts of God that are not the colonial ones,
Hmm.
that are more abstracted and less defined. But the great Nkulunkulu, the great one at the beginning kind of thing. But be that all as it may, the respect of the ancestors is this passing on of wisdom. And that's why the ancestors are used as this yardstick of what you're supposed to do right. What fascinates me, if you think about Hindu culture with
Yes.
its idea of reincarnation,
Yes.
and that idea later, of course, it comes to the West through Pythagoras, in
Yes.
700 BC. So it's a very powerful ancient idea. And in sometimes I think, we've just got different words and different kind of costumes for ideas to wear, but both reincarnation and ancestors are essentially talking about how the past bears on the present, how we inherit knowledge from the past, how we learn from the mistakes of the past.
Mm-hmm.
So they're
And
just kind of cultural frameworks for how the past creates us as we are.
yes, a sort of a slightly different story, a different sort of
Yeah.
concept, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, similar kind of intentional or idea sort of behind it. So
And I
I mean,
mention it because Westerners often think that the idea of ancestor veneration is kind of primitive, but it
yes.
isn't. If you take apart what it really is, it isn't. It's just a framework for something that's much deeper than that.
Yes, and I mean, look at the New Age tradition now, where everybody talk about things like ancestral trauma
Yeah.
and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that is the influence of indigenous culture.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
and I mean, you could even talk about that in terms of DNA. Actually, what's the difference?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just a different metaphor, really, for sort of
Exactly.
inheriting characteristics, qualities, potentials from your ancestors.
Yeah, precisely.
So, I mean, going back to your relationship with astrology, as a former South African myself, I'm fascinated by how you bridge that world between sort of being European on one hand and African on the other.
It is something that, although there are many so-called white sangomas, mostly they are expected to kind of follow things the African way. It's not that, I mean, it's complicated because the whole tradition of being a Sangoma is very much based on tradition. Okay,
Mm.
fair enough. So these, and the connection with the ancestors, traditional methods. But if you ask, why is it that white people can do that? They don't expect the white people to follow the, Zulu ancestors, but
Hmm.
they know that they, the Zulus, whoever it might be, have got methods to connect you to the ancestors. The Europeans have lost their methods. So you must dance our songs
Yes.
and sing and dance our way because that will connect you to the ancestors. But it's your ancestors, it's not Zulus you're connecting to. In the
Yes.
water spirit, everyone's the same, so it doesn't matter. So there was always that. But at the same time, like when I was initiated and it did teach me how to read bones, but they
Uh-huh.
told me that I must use my tarot cards because those are my ancestors' way.
So those are your bones. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
When it
Yes.
came to astrology, so the interesting thing is there is very scant evidence or use of anything like astrology anywhere in Africa.
Uh-huh.
And there's stories about the stars. There's certainly mythology about them and
Uh-huh.
all of those things which all human beings have. There's the use of the stars for planting and for reaping. All of
Mm.
those things exist as well. But
Okay.
the astrological idea of influence or relationship or whatever it is, that doesn't exist in African tradition. So one of the reasons, in fact, I did the masters in cultural astrology and astronomy at Wales University.
Uh-huh.
And they essentially headhunted me for that degree.
Oh, interesting. So was this Nick Campion and
Yeah.
Bernadette Brady, and that's yes.
Exactly. So
Uh-huh.
they actually offered me a place on the PhD program.
Wow.
And I flippantly, I've only got a bachelor's degree anyway. So I flippantly, it was ridiculous. I didn't want to do that. And it eats up people's lives, PhDs. And
Yes,
I thought,
yes.
I'm not going to parachute. The field was archaeoastronomy. I don't want
Mm,
to parachute into people who've been doing that their whole lives. That's not
yes.
me.
Uh-huh.
So I politely declined and threw out a joking line, if you ever got a scholarship lying around for the master's degree, which is a taught master's, looks
Mhm.
really interesting. So they threw
Yes.
me a scholarship. They gave me one and
Oh,
next thing you know.
amazing.
But it turned out that part of the reason was to try and overcome this kind of white men go to Africa and do anthropology. They
Mm,
wanted, as someone who is African, never didn't matter that I was white, but someone who is African to do anthropology from within.
interesting.
So, so it was on Sangomas, and I was an insider, so it was insider anthropology essentially, and uh, and that's when I discovered there's no way that they have any astrology, but the people. So it's in Ponderland, which is incredibly rural and largely untouched
Uh-huh.
by Western influence still. And so people understood the sense. There was sense in that I was reading the stars, although they had no idea of exactly what I was doing. It made sense when I said I'm reading the stars as my divination. They all
Okay.
thought, okay, well, that's cool. They just didn't know how. And one night, we were sitting in a hut in an African Sangoma ceremony. They
Mm-hmm.
go on for, on average, about 3 days.
Gosh.
The Sangomas themselves are not allowed to sleep during that time. But the general public who all come to sing and clap and eat, they are.
Okay.
So the Sangomas are not allowed to sleep because you've called the ancestors to be there from the world of spirit. You can't now go sleep. They're here. However, there's the rejoinder, and this is South African. However, if the Sangoma does go to sleep, then you're not allowed to wake them up because they're in the world of their ancestors themselves. You can't drag them out.
Okay. So yeah, it's sort of kind of the dream world sort of thing.
Exactly. So here we
Okay.
are on night 2
Mm-hmm.
of the ceremony. It was early in my days of going to Pondoland. I knew very little of that language at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's me, there's the chief Sangoma who was of that ceremony. He was like the most intimidating but captivating man you could ever imagine. And everyone was asleep. All the Sangomas and all the villagers, except him and I. We didn't have each other's language at this point.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, about 3 a.m., because I'm keeping awake because I'm a good Sangoma. So,
Uh-huh.
and I'm also trying to impress him because he didn't know me very well at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was this other white guy from the city. But
Right.
I don't think it ever mattered that I was white because no one really sees that. But who am I? So anyway, so we're sitting there and this girl pops her head through the hut door. And she like sees that everyone's asleep and she's just about to retreat. And he calls her over
Mm-hmm.
and she's terrified. She's like trembling. And they say a whole bunch of things to each other that I didn't quite understand, but I could hear the word problem in Pondo
Okay.
being repeated. And then the next thing, he grabbed her hand, he grabbed my hand, he ran out, he dragged us outside. Now, the sky in here in the Southern Hemisphere, you'll remember the Milky Way is astonishing. The sky in rural Pondoland is like it must have been thousands of years ago.
Mm.
And here we are in this rural environment outside this hut we could have been thousands of years ago, under this incredible sky. And the Sangoma points at the sky
Mm-hmm.
with his one finger and points at her. And he says to me, now read.
No pressure.
And it's like, but I was just so blown away by his whole putting together of me reading the stars.
Yes.
He would have no concept of actually how I read the stars. And back then there were no cell phones to like check out the latest chart.
No, absolutely. But it goes straight back to the Mesopotamians and who literally would call
Exactly.
astrology the heavenly writing. And, who would
Exactly.
spend all those hours out in the desert up on their ziggurats, looking up at the stars
Yeah,
and sort of trying to divine the message of the heavenly writing, you know?
exactly. And that's exactly what it struck me as. And even though
Mm.
I was daunted, like, I've got to think fast, what am I going to do? I still appreciated that I was like a Babylonian, that there we were looking at the sky, and there's the two of them waiting for me to read the word of God for the
Yes,
ancestors out of the
yes.
sky.
Yes, yes. Yes, there are so many overlaps actually, like when you go back and you study the early Mesopotamians and things between the traditional cultures and astrology. Even the scribes who would spend their sort of their time, the astrologer scribes, they had sort of lineages as well, like family
Yeah,
lineages, where it would happen through sort of like ancestral lines that people would learn to be um astrologers and things like that. It wasn't just anybody.
yeah,
Um,
very
and
much so.
I'm sure that a lot of knowledge at that stage uh, wasn't passed down by clay tablet. It would have been
Exactly.
oral, you
Exactly. As
know?
much as those clay tablets exist, one of the very few complete Babylonian texts that anyone's bothered to translate because of the bias against Babylonians, which went on until about 10 years ago, for
Mm,
literally thousands of years, is astonishing. And
mm.
I'm convinced it's because their skin wasn't white enough. So
Absolutely.
they'll miss what
Yes,
they say,
absolutely.
you
Like the
know?
Greeks had to sort of tape that it was
Exactly.
them. It was
Exactly.
Pythagoras who invented the
Exactly.
theorem,
Yes.
but the Babylonians already had it. Like it's
And the
there in the British
Babylonians
Museum.
they had three-dimensional trigonometry before the Greeks did.
Yes. Yes, they did.
Right? So they had their record, which was the
Yes.
record of everything they observed. But as you say, there must have been so much oral law that isn't written
Yes.
on those tablets.
Yes. So back to Ponduland. So I mean, what happened?
So what I did, the only way I could think of faking, so I asked her her birthday. And then from that, I could figure out where all the outer planets were.
Uh-huh.
And I can always figure out where Saturn and Jupiter are
Mm-hmm.
because I know where mine are. So if I know someone else's age, I
Yes.
can in my head work out where theirs must be. And then I know her sun from her birthday, so I can guesstimate Mercury and
And
maybe Venus.
Venus. Yes.
So
From the
between all
sun.
of that, I had enough information to go on compared with what I know the current transits to be
Yes.
because I just know them. And
Mm.
I had enough for a reading. And so I started telling her stuff.
Mhm.
And the Sangoma just collapsed laughing because everything I said was true.
Huh.
And he was so amazed. He just couldn't stop laughing that I was getting out of the sky and it was all real.
I mean,
But
that's amazing.
it is. And for me, the lasting thing that was also his openness to that.
Yes. And that is the wonderful thing about Africa, is that it is
Yeah,
still so open
exactly.
to magic. Like it's
Exactly.
not like in the West where there's this kind of disenchantment where people immediately do this thing that Patrick Curry calls modernist policing, where you
Right.
immediately sort of like if something like that happened, you would then try to justify it.
Yeah.
Like and explain it away, it's like scientifically, or say, oh no, it must just have been whatever, you know. Yes, and I think that's one of the true gifts I think of Africa is that belief in magic is still so alive, and that is
Yeah.
I think a really important part of the healing process too. Is that
Exactly that.
you
Exactly
know,
that. Because so we as Westerners, so there's traditional medicine and there's modern medicine, and never the twain shall meet. Or if you go to I remember like when my dad was once long ago having chemotherapy, and I wanted to bring him these herbs that would support him.
yes,
They wouldn't let me.
huh.
And so there was like, never the twain shall meet. Whereas in African medicine, if you bring something and say, in my culture, we use this as medicine, they'll say, thank you very much. We'd love that. So good to know we've got now more medicine.
Yes,
So they're flexible, they adapt to what's there. And even like, so the thesis for my master's was whether the proliferation of white sangomas since freedom in 94 represents any change in the cosmology. And
okay,
so I interviewed lots of sangomas in the rural area who were astonished by my question because they couldn't find a way to distinguish what between white sangomas and any other. So to them, my question made no sense, which was great. That is a great education in itself.
yes,
Right. But I said things like, so then this one woman was telling me the story, when in my day, when someone was training, they called it twaza.
okay.
Twaza means a blossom.
Oh,
So
beautiful.
when someone was a twaza, so twazas have to eat with their hands, right? As a form of, because you have to have your ego broken right down to zero and then it's built up again. So in the
Interesting.
beginning, they have to eat with their hands and not allowed to use implements.
Mhm.
And she said, in my day, they didn't even have a plate. We would make a depression in the floor of the hut, and they had to eat out of that.
Hmm.
So I said, so then the white people came along and bought plates, and now everyone's using plates. So she says, yes. So I said, well, doesn't that mean the white people changed your methods? So she looked at me like I was a complete idiot. And she said, no, we saw how useful plates were, and we chose to use them. No one forced us to use plates.
I mean, that's just so wonderful, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it just cuts through that sort of patronizing sort of
Exactly.
attitude that's, the kind of the colonial mindset would have, which is like, we civilize the savages.
Exactly.
You know,
Forgetting that people have choice and wisdom and experience, and they can decide, I like that, I don't like that. This suits me. It advances me, which is what they were doing.
yes. And I mean, I think a similar sort of thing happened when the Romans invaded Britain. That
Yeah.
people could still choose whether they wanted to sort of like pursue kind of Roman types of gods and things like that, or if they wanted to mix it up. I mean, even the Romans themselves, I think, were quite sort of syncretic. So were the Greeks, actually. Um,
Exactly. And the same even happened when the Christians came to Britain.
yeah. So that culture doesn't actually die away. It just kind of integrates into something else. And you can see that in Lily's work. I mean, to
Yeah.
me, if you look at his the ephemeris that he used to sort of produce every year, I mean, they are Babylonian to the core.
Yeah.
Where he's talking about weather, eclipses. He's talking about folklore. It's all kind of like mixed in there, and it's still in those early traditions of the Babylonians. With all their sort of weather and ephemera and that kind of thing. Yeah, and so it's, I think, a much sort of more constructive way to look at how these things develop, instead of, as you say, like the Western idea of polarizing things and sort of
Exactly. Because
splitting
it's an
things.
issue of cultural protectionism or hegemony
Yes.
versus practical adaptability, which makes the culture survive. So here you have, of course, a culture which has been going on for X number of centuries or
Mm.
more, intact. Or even, you could even say that of Hindu culture, which absorbed Western astrology and into its own system and all of
Yes.
that. Um, but when you get these very we're right kind of cultures that don't survive time because they're not flexible.
Yes. Yes. It's very true. Whereas, like, say that the Romans and the Greeks, I mean, especially in sort of Hellenistic Egypt, it was a huge melting pot of cultures that was sort of mixing, and it's from that a lot of our traditions and religions still come.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Even a lot of our astrology comes from there.
yes. Um, I, I, I was quite interested to hear that you lecture in integrative medicine, and I wondered if you could maybe sort of talk about how that happens, and whether there's kind of astrological overtones, really or not really.
Not really. Well, I had one odd little experience astrologically with that. So part of the reason why I ended up lecturing in the postgrad diploma here at Stellenbosch University in
Hmm.
integrative medicine for a few years, part of it was my history lecture. And I don't know where I first gave it. People in the medical field started cottoning onto.
Hmm.
And actually, now that I think about it, where it all started was I once gave a lecture at Cape Town University to
Hmm.
the medical students on history of medicine because they had an elective lecture that once a month or something they
Uh-huh.
could choose any lecturer of their choice from outside faculty to come and lecture to them. So that month they somehow chose me.
Huh.
And that was first to fourth year. So it was a large part of the medical school. So I went to give this lecture and I thought, okay, fantastic. They're medical students at the university, so they'll know about the history of medicine. So I can dive right in
Uh-huh.
with hot, cold, dry, wet and explain all of those. I can dive right in.
Hmm.
Herbalism is the origin of allopathic medicine to this day.
Hmm.
So I started off my lecture by saying, okay, so how much history of medicine have you studied?
Hmm.
And I looked around this large amphitheater thing, and eventually one person raised her hand and stood up and said, we only learned one thing about the history of medicine. And I said, what was that? And she said that it was all wrong.
Hmm.
And the faculty were all standing at the back. And I saw them universally go red. And they realized, how does that sound at a university? So
Hmm.
that got me known in the medical fraternity for my Bible thumping about the history of medicine that they ought to know.
Uh-huh.
And because Western medicine's history is fascinating. People speak about allopathy as if it was something bad. Herbalism is allopathic medicine. But
Hmm.
what isn't known well is in Culpeper's time and before, it's holistic medicine.
Yes.
If you treat the patient separately from the disease, you treat them both, you've got to take the environment into account. It's all based on things like eating the wrong foods and,
Hmm.
and, and everything that we now know to be true. So
Yes.
so I started becoming known for that. And then the person who started the integrative medicine course at Stellenbosch invited me one year to do that lecture. And when I did it,
Hmm.
it became part of the course and then I became one of the lecturers. And then the next thing, I became more involved in the course because also the issues with this culture where we have African medicine and Western medicine living together,
Uh-huh.
me as one person also had to solve a lot of the problems that became important, in fact, to both universities, Cape Town and Stellenbosch. I started lecturing on the issue of you have people who come from a particular culture, say they come from a traditional African culture. In a
Uh-huh.
traditional African culture, you go and see the Sangoma. You take your relative with you. You don't go alone, so that you
Okay.
don't have a wool pulled over your eyes, and so that you'll properly hear and understand. The
Uh-huh.
Sangoma will treat you, including, it will ask you about your life, your family, your neighbors, all the circumstances, and then
Uh-huh.
include all of that in the treatment. So it's this very rounded, holistic approach. And the treatment is kept very open. Nothing is secret about it.
Okay.
If you go then to a Western doctor, you go in where it's a very clinical environment, a silver desk, everyone's wearing white.
Yes.
They speak to you in a language you don't understand, using funny names of long Latin names of things that you don't understand what it is.
Uh,
You're not allowed to take someone with you, and you've got to, everything is discreet and private. You don't talk about your illness. That your neighbors, no one else comes into the story at all, and you're given a medicine you don't know what it is. It's a sort of pill in a bottle.
yes.
Can't
Yes.
see a plant or anything you understand.
Yes.
So as a result of that, people actually don't heal. There's
No, they
such a
don't.
key emotional component in our healing
Yes.
that causes that problem.
Well, this is so interesting that you're saying this because this is something that I was discussing the other week with Tobias Churton about Rosicrucianism and Paracelsian medicine. That was the whole thing. Is that and astrology, when it was still a cosmology, used to do this. That
Yeah,
the chart tells you everything about the person, and nothing is divorced. You don't isolate the body from the rest of the chart. You know,
exactly.
it's part
Exactly.
one house in the sort of the wheel, but the planets are working through all of the houses, and they're all linked through aspects,
Yeah.
and this is how people would I mean even Culpeper and Lily. I'm sure the first thing they do is look at the person's natal chart.
Of course, exactly.
So yeah, it's quite stark, and then they wonder why people don't, as you say,
Yeah.
kind of heal because you're only treating the body as if it was a car, instead of sort of seeing it as part of an environment, relationships, a psychology. Yeah, it's really really
But
interesting.
in the end, then I did get to influence the doctors with the history of medicine lectures.
Okay.
And then as one of the lecturers on the course, one of the facilitators, I taught them multicultural medicine, basically dealing with multiculturalism, how to do all of that. So that was quite interesting. It was the
Hmm.
Sangoma, the mixture of the African and European in me that was actually put into a good framework. The interesting
Yes.
little astrological twist was that so the integrative medicine course,
Hmm.
the head of department of medicine was strongly opposed to it, because still a lot of conventional medicine doesn't like integrative medicine.
Yes.
But nevertheless, the university was teaching it. It was externally funded, so you couldn't stop it. And and every year I'd give my lecture, and then one year, because we started the year with that history lecture. So
Hmm.
one year, and the students all come up to me afterwards. It creates quite a buzz that's full of interesting things. So they're all coming up to me, and this one older man comes up to me,
Hmm.
and he says to me, "I have a question about Venus."
Hmm.
And the facilitator, who's the one who employed me on the course, she leans behind me and she whispers in my ear so that he won't hear, "That's Dr. So-and-so, the head of department."
Hmm.
She's
Interesting.
warning me. So she's warning me, and he's not happy that I'm an astrologer. So she whispers this into my ear.
Hmm.
So I think, oh no. And he says, I don't, but I mean the astrological planet. And then he asks me a question about Venus and how it's related to the influence of certain substances that might be used in medicine. He was authentically interested. He was
Huh.
authentically reading about it and had gained good information. I was
Huh.
blown away. It reminded me that at heart, most scientists actually are open-minded. They are trying to learn.
Yes,
Um,
they
I
are.
like
That
to read that anyway.
No, I think it's very true. I mean, have you ever seen that documentary Third Eye Spies?
I haven't seen that, no.
It's the fascinating, and I mean, it starts off in the sort of in the more kind of government program type of thing, where they're trying to sort of like use psychic ability and remote viewing and that kind of thing to to gain information about, say, Iran or
Right.
Iraq and that kind of thing. But then eventually it moves to a discussion about what the implications of this program were for science. And I can't remember the physicist who narrates the whole thing, but he comes to England and he goes to Cambridge and he's talking to scientists there, and they are saying the same thing, that their research, particularly in fields like biology, are showing them that everything is connected, in
Right.
this kind of this biosphere, and they're sort of saying that the scientists amongst themselves will admit this, but they never dare say anything publicly because of the stigma. It's
Or-
really
Mm.
interesting. It's a fascinating documentary. I think one of the best I've seen in a long time. It really, kind of bridges that gap and also shows how everybody's actually psychic.
Right.
That everyone has those innate abilities.
Yeah.
Like when they were trying to do control, they tried to sort of, have remote views, and then they bring in control subjects, and even the control subjects would pick stuff up, with them doing the remote view. So yeah, it's fascinating. So changing kind of hearts and minds, and a lot of the time, I think it is just about a sort of a perception or a mindset shift.
Exactly.
These
Yeah.
divisions are sort of very like artificial. But I mean, if we get sort of take that as a sort of a premise, I'm interested to know the African approach, for example, to things like AI.
Mm.
Has that sort of really become a subject of
Mm,
discussion or debate?
No, it hasn't. The one thing, not at all that I'm aware of anyway. Um, one thing that occurs to me as you say that
Hmm.
is, so generally in African culture, you always assume that people are telling the truth and that they're going to stand by their word.
Okay.
So the interesting thing about AI, which is a variation of the truth at best,
Yes.
is that, as the damage it causes in the sense of people not knowing what's true and what isn't, because they assume if you produce a picture and you say this is X,
Uh-huh.
then they will absolutely think it is, not because they're naive, because their culture says another human being is going to tell you the truth.
Yes. Interesting.
So that's why, I don't know what are the consequences, and obviously people realize it isn't true very fast, and then they're not fools. But just in terms of damaging that underlying culture of the trustworthiness.
Yes, yes, and also I think I suppose for me the most interesting question is this idea that these tech pros are obsessed with, which is that there's the ghost in the machine, that there is this sort of
Yes.
consciousness like in a machine that they are going to sort of invent, which to me is the most grossly inflated kind of Faustian
Yeah.
humanism, where you are you turn yourself into gods, and so now you are creating like a Frankenstein type of
Yeah.
thing, and how like an African would view that type of attitude.
That's really interesting. Again, I don't officially know any answer. I can only speculate.
Yes.
Because, it's similar to how in the Jewish tradition there's a thing called a golem, which
Hmm.
is a mannequin made out of mud that is animated by a spirit but not a soul, usually as a protection. It's like it was invented to protect the Jews from persecution.
Okay.
In African culture, there's something called a tokoloshe, which is a
Yes.
similar idea. It's not for protection, it's often used to threaten or attack.
Mm.
But it's the same thing. It's an animated, man-made creature. And
Interesting.
I suspect that, that Faustian ghost in the machine thing would trigger that idea that it's inherently wrong to do that.
Yes, and that you can't sort of ever assume that that thing is really conscious. It's more like a kind of a zombie, like a
Yeah.
halfling sort of thing. There's the appearance. I mean, to me, it's more kind of Wizard of Oz, that they're trying to trick people into thinking that something's
Yeah.
conscious, but it's not actually. That it's a
Yeah.
trick. So it's
Very much so.
yeah. It's I mean, I'm sure that this will be something that will sort of develop over time. This discussion and stuff, but I certainly think it throws up all sorts of kind of questions about how we navigate the idea of like a conscious universe, for example. Like, how else can you explain astrology except that the universe is conscious and that you have a relationship with it, which is like anathema to science. Um, and and then you have these anomalies like kind of AI that really, I suppose, push the boundaries and force these more kind of philosophical questions, I guess. But I mean, just going back to your astrology, I mean, what is your relationship with it now?
Well, I still practice as my full-time job,
Okay.
which it has been for 36 years. So, I mean, to me, it's the other language that I speak.
Hmm.
So I love astrology.
Yes.
And to this very day, it's almost as if I've just started doing it. It gives me the same thrill every time
Mm.
when I see the benefit of it, when I see how people relate so strongly to what it says, etc. I feel as amazed and delighted as if it was all new to me.
Yes. Yes.
So, so I still have a great relation with astrology. Over the years, I transitioned from a 20th century astrology because I learned as a kid. So that
Mm-hmm.
was in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, I was then later taught, I was one of Robert Zola's students.
Ah.
So
Yes.
then I became medievalized. And then after that, I went to India and studied Vedic astrology there. And
Wow.
what that made me realize is that there had to be something like this in the West, because so much of Indian astrology, although they don't admit it, came from the West, from the Greeks.
Yes.
So I started then getting more interested in ancient astrology,
Mm-hmm.
which dovetailed well with medieval in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, I'm this hybrid. I'm very strongly traditional, but I still have a foot in, the 21st century. I use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, but not Lilith and Chiron. So I'm a
Yeah,
little
it's
bit of a,
interesting. Yeah, and
yeah,
I think I think Patrick Curry would sort of say that it's it's not really the techniques per se. It's more your relationship to
right.
astrology as a language, as a way of communicating like with the cosmos and sort of getting into that frame of mind where
Exactly.
you are able to divine. So whatever it is that works for you, there's no set way that you have to use all the asteroids or you have
Yeah,
to sort of like um use secondary progressions or this technique or that technique or this house or system or whatever.
exactly.
That it's really just a tool or a technique for you to get into that mindset
Yeah.
where you. That's why I'm so interested in this. In your relationship between astrology and being a sangoma, in terms of how you actually have they influenced how you prepare a chart, for example, or how you get ready for a consultation.
To some extent, and my hesitation is because the Vedic ones also do that in a similar way,
Hmm.
and that is that there is an element of in Vedic astrology, they believe that you are essentially channeling the muse when you do the astrology. So you have to
Yes.
live a more spiritual life. You got to try and be pure
Uh-huh.
in the Vedic sense. That would be vegetarian, all those things. So so that did influence me, even though I can't pin my finger and say I'm channeling the muse of astrology.
Yes.
Sangoma, you also prepare yourself, you clear your space, you clear your mind,
Hmm.
you do all of those kind of things. And so that influenced my astrology. That's still taking
Interesting.
that same approach that
Yes.
it's like, even I don't know if it's a divination. Is it divination? Is it the moment? I don't know,
Uh-huh.
but I prepare myself as if it's a divination by trying to clear my mind and receive. I don't think of it as a spiritual thing, as in I'm receiving from spirits or some outside information that's beyond the chart.
Uh-huh.
Like still, I prepare myself that way, also to get myself out of the way and not have preconception.
Yes. Yes.
So that's
Yes.
also a Sangoma thing is very much getting yourself out of the way.
Yes. And I mean, I think that's it's probably something that's got lost a lot in astrological training now, where it's sort of more about getting your certificate in these techniques and sort of uh, becoming an expert in terms of knowledge, whereas you still have to develop as a person in order to be able to counsel.
Yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yes, which is part of that is sort of getting your ego out of the way and learning to like focus on the other person. And
Exactly.
yes, yes, yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I was also interested in um, going back to the Sangoma ceremonies and things like that. I know this was a topic of discussion when I did my masters, and people like Jeffrey Cornelius were quite interested in anthropology and this idea of inside and outside,
Mm.
also this idea of how, to an extent, divination is a form of performance, like a
Yes.
kind of like a piece of theater, and that it's really important that the client suspends their disbelief because
Yes.
otherwise the treatment is not going to work.
It's
Um,
interesting. I mean, so when Jeffrey was here, Jeffrey Cornelius, I took him to Sangoma.
oh, did you? And
Yeah.
how did that go?
Well, the funny thing is, and it so suits him, Jeffrey, it's just unbelievable how this worked. So the day that we went to the Sangoma was incredibly sick and
Uh
couldn't
huh.
do a reading.
Okay.
So the whole thing with Jeffrey of how what happens also reflects the moment and all of that.
Yes. Yes.
But he did write a paper after that on divination and chicanery, and
Yes.
it
Yes.
was inspired by that non-visit to the Sangoma. And I find I only partly agree with him
Mm-hmm.
because while there is chicanery, or however you pronounce the word, there is that, there is the suspension of disbelief. All of those things are there. There is also authentic magic.
Yes, there is absolutely. No, I agree with you totally. Yes, I mean that's certainly not what I was sort of like implying at all. But yes, I suppose Jeffrey, he's trying to kind of come at it from the Western skeptic
Yes.
arguments of trying to address those arguments. But no, absolutely. I mean, the two things go together.
Yeah.
And I mean certainly if you went back to say the Greeks, they would consider theatre to be a form of healing, like a mass
Exactly. Very much so.
form
Very,
of
very much
healing.
so. Mm.
Those things wouldn't necessarily be seen as separate. So no, I mean, I just think that sometimes what I meant more was that you need a degree of spectacle in order
Yes. Yes.
for the magic to work.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
for the client
And,
to
and
participate.
exactly. And in fact, any form of magic works that way. Even if you take the idea of magic in the Western world, the
Hmm.
magician, and
Yes.
it's the same. It still requires the spectacle in order for it to happen. And that's how it became conjuring magic, which still has that spectacle
Yes. Yes.
with fake
Absolutely.
magic.
Yes. Yeah. It's so interesting, and then how those
Mm,
things diverged.
exactly.
Yeah, fascinating. Gosh, Rod. Well, I mean, we've covered quite a lot of territory. Were there any
We
sort of
have it.
things that I've left out, or that's sort of anecdotes that you wanted to share with us?
No, I don't think so. I think, the one thing I could say is that for me, the lesson of being these two different people, a Westerner and an African in one person, an astrologer and a Sangoma in one person, is that the idea of division is false.
Mm, yeah.
It's not two people in one. I'm one person. And that flexibility that I was talking about in terms of our spiritual practice and belief doesn't mean laissez-faire, just accept everything.
Uh-huh.
But it does mean to realize that the divisions are artificial. We're all humans. It all comes from the same place, similarly.
Yes.
And it's the human effort to understand ourselves and our world, whether we're looking up at the sky or down at the plants growing in the forest floor. We are trying to understand ourselves. We're trying to heal ourselves.
Uh,
And I think ultimately that's what I've learned through this whole experience is that essentially it matters not whether you're looking up at the stars or down at the forest floor. Your aim is to try and heal the pain of being a human being.